We now move into our first working session after lunch, where we are going to be looking into business and the new development agenda. And as I've been saying throughout the morning and over lunch, we face a formidable challenge, which is to provide a concerted business input to what is going to be an extremely complex intergovernmental process, which hopefully will result in a set of useful and meaningful targets coming out after 2015. A very intensive work program. As we meet here, we know that the panel of eminent persons, the high-level group, is meeting in town. And so outputs from this discussion are very much going to be inputs into their work. Before we get started on this, we are privileged to have with us John Fallon, who's the CEO of Pearson International, who are our sponsors for this excellent day of discussions. John has responsibility for Pearson's education business outside of North America, which is very appropriate in the context of this morning's discussions, where several times we touched on the need for skills and capacity in the workforce and in the management and in the entrepreneurs who drive the business processes, the businesses, which lead to the development outcomes that we've been discussing. So John, great to have you here, and please, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I've been asked to give a business perspective on what the post-Millennium Development Framework might look like. Before I do, I should advise you, warn you even, that the guiding principle of my company, Pearson, the tagline that accompanies everything we do, is always learning. And looking at the room, both those responsible for organising today's event, my fellow panellists, many of the participants here, I do feel I've got a lot more to learn from this debate than I have to contribute to it. So I'll keep this relatively brief, and I'll also try to stick to the brief, which was to address three seemingly deceptively simple questions. One, how do you make the Millennium Development Goals more relevant to business? And what's the business case for contributing to those goals, and how do you align a business around them? Two, as we think ahead to 2015, what does business see as the priorities for the new Millennium Development Goals? Should we build on the existing ones or insist on a new framework? How specific should the new goals be in terms of targets, outcomes, timescales, and the like? And three, how do you incentivize greater business participation in achieving those goals, and just where should the role of business begin and end? Now, if you were listening carefully, you probably heard 8 questions there, not 3. And you may conclude that math, or maths, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're from, is not my strong point, which would, of course, be a little embarrassing for someone who works for an education company. But I was actually quoting from the speaker's brief I was given, a poor excuse, I know. But more appropriately, I think the questions do fall under those 3 broad themes. So let me try and give some thoughts on each of them in turn. In doing so, I'm going to draw largely on my experiences, my own company and my own line of work, which, as I say, is education. First, I don't think it's a case of asking how you make the development goals relevant to business. I think we should be asking a fundamentally different question, which is, what are the biggest, the most urgent problems facing our global community, all 7 billion and more of us, and how can business help to solve them? For what good companies are all about, I think, is identifying the problems that need solving around the world, bringing together the brightest and best people they can, and giving them the resources, the direction, the freedom they need to get on and tackle them. That's not to say, of course, that profits aren't important. Of course they are. They're absolutely fundamental. The enterprise doesn't exist without them. But profits sustain a business. They're not what defines it. The profits arise from doing something important or valuable to society and doing it really well. And the profits, of course, are then redeployed in the invention and the innovation that enables you to do it even better. I hope that's true of my own company. Our central purpose is to help people make progress in their lives through learning, and we aim to measure everything we do by that yardstick, making learning more accessible, affordable, effective. And I would imagine it's true of every single business represented here today. Pharmaceutical companies, as we heard before, want to help people to live longer, to live healthier lives. Technology companies want to capitalize on cloud computing and mobile technology to make access to knowledge and information cheaply and universally available, and so on. Now, can we all point to global corporations throughout history, and especially in recent years, that have lost sight of that central purpose, of their central purpose? You bet, of course we can. Do all of us in business constantly, in managing our P&Ls, have to juggle short and long-term concerns? You bet we do. But so does everybody in any walk of life constantly have to balance the short term and the long term. So it seems to me at least that business is, to answer the first question, business will engage, it will contribute, it will align if and when it sees a Millennium Development Goal that's worth striving for, and when it sees a meaningful and sustainable role for itself in tackling it. That's why, as I think you've heard this morning, the private sector is now seen rightly as a major partner in the global battle to improve health, to tackle poverty, to stimulate economic growth and ensure the opportunities that brings are shared with a wider group of people. It's why business, all of us here today, understand that we can't have a viable future without healthy, sustainable communities. And it's why, as we've already heard today, companies big and small are helping to deliver progress towards the current Millennium Development Goals. We're doing so not out of altruism, but because it's what we are in business to do in the first place. That leads us on to our second group of questions. What does business, just to remind you, what does business see as the priorities for the new Millennium Development Goals? Should we build on the new one, on the existing ones, or insist on a new framework? How specific should we be in terms of target outcomes, timescales, and the like? Let me try to answer that by talking about the Millennium Development Goal I know most about, the one relating to education. And the education goal is a simple one. It's to ensure that all children, regardless of gender, have access to primary schooling. And as I think we heard earlier, the goal's simplicity is its greatest strength. And although it's stalled in recent years, progress has certainly been made. There are now 40 million more children, just about, in school today than in the year 2000. Enrollment rates in the world's poorest countries have improved from 60% to over 80%, and that at a time when populations have risen quite dramatically. The simplicity of the goal also enables us to see clearly and unambiguously how much we still have to do to achieve it in its totality. So there are today still, for all that progress over the last 12 years, 31 million children just in Africa alone of primary school age who do not attend primary school. And of course, it's the children who need that schooling most who have been denied it. It's the very poorest, it's the girls, it's the children living in a rural area, the children in a country at war or at conflict whom are least likely to be at school. And knowing that gives a simple, clear objective around which to rally. So, for example, the new Special Envoy for Global Education, Gordon Brown, thinks that the UN's Education First initiative, which I think is launched formally tomorrow by the Secretary of General, can get every one of those 31 million children into school by 2015. No mean feat. But as the Brookings Institute has pointed out, there's been a price to be paid for the simplicity of that goal. For we shouldn't confuse enrollments with learning. There are still as many as 200 million children who are attending school but still not really learning anything very much at all, especially not the basics of how to read and write. The average number of years children spend in education in sub-Saharan Africa is 5. yet 1 in 2 of those children reaches adolescence unable to read, to write, or to perform basic numeracy tasks. To put it crudely, universal basic education says every child counts. But even if we achieve the Millennium Development Goal by 2015, even if we get those 31 million of children into school, half those children won't actually be able to count. And that's not going to change unless we set ourselves a different, a higher standard. So this analysis would suggest that as we think about the next iteration of the Millennium Development Goals in 2015, we need to find a way of retaining their simplicity but adding a harder edge to them. We should build on the existing priorities but make them more specific and focus more on the efficacy of what we do, on the outcome. Because ultimately, it's not access to primary schooling that counts, it's the quality of that primary schooling. Have we improved literacy and numeracy rates that matters? And the research suggests that if you're going to move the dial on that, you actually have to think about what happens before the age of 5. You have to tackle early childhood development, as the battle is often won and lost before a child even gets to the school gates for the first time. You have to look at the quality of the teaching as well, happening in primary schools every day. And you have to think beyond the age of 11 too. How can Africa sustain the very encouraging GDP growth that we've seen over the last decade when only 6% of its children will ever receive any form of tertiary education compared to over 80% in the countries of the OECD? So that analysis would lead me to say that my answer to the second question, how do you build on the current Millennium Development Goals, certainly as it relates to education, would be to say you've got to focus on 3 priorities. You've got to focus on early childhood development, you've got to focus on basic literacy and numeracy by the end of primary school, and you need to be thinking about better post-primary educational opportunities too. Is that a particularly business perspective or one that's more widely shared? Well, as what I'm really advocating is the agenda adopted by the Brookings Institute and the wider community, it's clearly the latter. But maybe where business can play a unique role is really thinking about this issue as how do you really focus on outcomes, not inputs? How do you measure return on investment? What's your strategy for achieving these goals? And I would say that for every investment we make and every education project we engage in, we should be asking ourselves 4 key questions. Are we setting ourselves a very clear learning outcome? How are we going to measure with hard data our success in achieving that objective? Have we got a clear and viable plan to deliver the improved outcome? And along with all the partners, everyone who's going to be involved in delivering it, do we really understand what's needed, what capacity is required to deliver on that plan? To do that, it requires all of us involved in global education, governments, donors, the private sector, to act in a very disciplined way. We'll need to analyse the data, measure the return on investment, and when we find the often basic, simple, systemic processes that do work, we'll need to scale them quickly and effectively. And this perhaps hints at the answer to our third group of questions about how do you encourage greater business participation in achieving these goals, and just where should the role of business begin and end? Well, in answer to the first part of that question, business, certainly in education, needs to get itself better organised. Because in education, most business activity in the sector is fragmented, and it is largely restricted today to corporate social responsibility. The Global Business Coalition for Education, which is drawing on the success and lessons from our colleagues in the global health community, is bringing together a wide range of business sectors, all pledging to work together to improve learning outcomes across Africa. The measure of our success will be if it results in less loose talk in annual reports about lives touched through a wide range of well-meaning but all too often ill-coordinated and incoherent piecemeal initiatives, and more about lives transformed in clear, tangible, measurable ways. answering the second part of that question, where should the role of business begin and end, I think brings us back to where we started. And it's a question that my own company, the largest profit-making education enterprise in the world, can't duck. So I'll try to answer it, and I'll hope not to sound too self-serving in the process. Our role should begin and end, I believe, we're trying to answer a simple question: what works? And when we know what works, something that is often notoriously difficult to nail in the black box of educational policy and practice, how can we share it as widely and successfully as possible? That means working with governments, with civil society, with local communities, with our companies, other companies, even our competitors, in an open way, working together where we can to share research and data given the size of the challenge. It means holding ourselves to account and providing the information that enables all our stakeholders to do so too, for how well we're doing in meeting our own goal in life, which is to make learning more accessible, affordable, and effective. And it means too being true to the philosophy of always learning, acknowledging the many things that we don't know, that we don't get right, but that we try to learn from and share those lessons with others. But it also means living up to the philosophy of the late, great C.K. Prahlad, who I was very proud to know and who was a member of the Pearson PLC board. It means treating, as he put it, the poor, not as victims or as wards of state, but as creative, resilient, value-conscious consumers. For they're not waiting around for all of us here in New York to opine as to what the next iteration of the Millennium Development Goals should be. They're doing their very best today and every day to get their children the very best education they can so they can progress in their lives as far and as fast as their talent will tell them. And we need to be doing what we can, when we can, to meet that need too, and not letting the litany of false dichotomies of which public or private, when it should actually be public and private, is one, which litter the educational policy debate to get in our way. For the poor know at the most visceral level what we rely on research and data to tell us, which is that for families and communities, for corporations and countries, better learning outcomes are fundamental to growth and prosperity. Better education, of which literacy and numeracy are the bedrock, is what drives invention and innovation. It drives flexibility and wealth in the widest and very best sense of that word. Poor education, on the other hand, all too often leads to stagnation, to decline, to conflict and global irrelevance. All the data also tells us that demographics apart, educational attainment, increasingly linked to technology, is the single most important driver of economic growth. It is what has driven the remarkable rise of Ban Ki-moon's own country, South Korea, over the last 40 years. It's why Brazil, China, India are all investing so much time and money and effort in educational reform. It's why policymakers from here in the United States and my own country in the UK are flocking to Singapore, to Hong Kong, and now to Shanghai to learn from the huge success and progress they've made in education in recent years. And it's why the emerging middle class, set to double in size over the next 20 years, primarily in those emerging economies of the South and the East, why for them education is now the single biggest item of household spending after housing and food. And it's why all of us in the global business community, working alongside our partners in government, civil society, local communities, need to put aside any differences or special interests and ask quite simply, how can we best help to achieve the current Millennium Development Goals, and how can we best contribute to setting and delivering the next generation of goals? Why? Well, because in the long run, it's good business, and because fixing the problems that really matter to our communities is actually the fundamental business that all of us, in one form or another, are in. So Thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to learning a lot more and being put right on all the things I've got wrong in the panel discussion now. So thank you.